Machiavelli was born in 1469 in Florence. This was a long time before the unified Italian Republic that we understand today, when individual city-states and areas govern themselves. Machiavelli, by the age of 29, had risen to the position of second chancellor to the Republic of Florence. Now, this was an important political position, and most importantly for our purposes, this allowed Machiavelli to meet other leaders, rulers, and people of political importance around Europe at the time. Machiavelli lost his position on the return to the power of the Medici family. And indeed, Machiavelli was implicated in a plot to overthrow Lorenzo de' Medici and was imprisoned and tortured. He refused to give any information and was almost certainly incorrectly implicated in this plot. However, he was exiled internally, that is to say, within the Florentine Republic, in a farm outside the city for much of the rest of his life. It was whilst on this farm that he wrote The Prince, the book which we'll be looking at here today. The key message of The Prince is this: how should a prince keep hold of his political position and his political power? We'll find out today that Machiavelli's answer to this was the ends justify the means so long as the ends are glorious. This doesn't mean that the prince can do whatever he wants to do. What it does mean, however, is if one ends up having a glorious leadership and a glorious state, anything you do in order to bring that about is fair game. Now, Machiavelli, when he was writing, was not the only person who was engaged in this kind of political exercise. There was lots of other advice books to princes being published at the time, each of which purported to show a prince how he should govern. Machiavelli differed from these other advice books to prince authors in one crucial way, and that is, he divorced the process from the Christian virtues. The other advice books to princes said that if one was to be a successful prince, you should follow the Christian virtues, you should keep your word, you shouldn't lie, you shouldn't steal, and so on and so forth. Machiavelli says that the one way in which a prince can guarantee to lose his position is to follow the Christian virtues all the time. This is because if a prince follows the Christian virtues, he will become predictable. If a prince always keeps his word, you know that if he says that he's going to do something, he's going to do it. If the prince always repays debts, for example, you know he's going to repay the debt, and so on and so forth. Predictability leads to failure, according to Machiavelli. And Machiavelli famously says, the man who wants to act virtuously in every way necessarily comes to grief amongst those who are not so virtuous. Other people are not as virtuous. If you want to keep your position as a prince, for Machiavelli, you must not keep your word, you must not follow the Christian virtues. And it was this way in which he differed from the other advice books to princes authors. Fortune plays a large part in the philosophy of Machiavelli, and for Machiavelli, fortune favours the brave. When he was writing, there was a school of thought called Stoicism that dominated a lot of philosophy. And the point of Stoicism was this: the vast majority of our lives is controlled by fortune, and there's very little we can do to influence fortune, so what one needed to do was protect ourselves from fortune. For example, imagine that you were driving to work and got stuck in a traffic jam, and you got annoyed and frustrated by sitting in that traffic jam. Now, a Stoic would say it's not that traffic jam which is causing you to be frustrated, it's your belief in a world without traffic jams. So if you get your sort of expectations about the world to match reality, one is in actual fact going to be much happier and more protected against the world. Right? So Stoicism says, in terms of what we're talking about here in Machiavelli, most of what a prince does is going to be affected by fortune. There's not all that much point fighting against it. Machiavelli has no time for this philosophy whatsoever, hence the phrase, fortune favours the brave. To illustrate the importance of fortuna, Machiavelli uses an example which doesn't sit particularly well in today's politically correct times, but nevertheless illustrates the point. Machiavelli says that fortune is like a woman. He's talking here about the goddess Fortuna, of course. And like any other woman, Machiavelli says she will return to the man who treats her roughly. So one needs to be rough and rough with fortune in order to attract her to you, just like Machiavelli says one needs to be rough to any other woman in order to attract her to you. In order to be this rough kind of male, Machiavelli says one needs to be a virtue. Now, this virtue bit is quite important here, because earlier on we were discussing the virtues, and we decided that Machiavelli didn't think one should follow the Christian virtues. So what precisely is Vertu? So in order to attract fortune to the prince needed to act according to Vertu, not virtues. We've already discussed how Machiavelli rejected the idea of the prince following the Christian virtues, because by following the Christian virtues it made him predictable. Vertu, on the other hand, is a different beast altogether. Imagine it this way: if we were all to meet and talk about what we thought were the virtues, we may disagree on a few, but we'd manage to have a list of them, wouldn't we? We would think to ourselves, if one was to follow the virtues, you would be honest, you would be selfless, you would be keep your word, and so on and so forth, and that these would apply in every given situation. So you could list them to that respect, what the virtues were. Vertu, on the other hand, you can't list in the same manner. The reason for this, for Machiavelli, is that it entirely depends upon the situation in which you were in at the time. Vertu, or virtuosity in politics, if you will, is about discovering what you need to do in the right circumstance, and doing it. That is to say, to learn the skill of politics. Think of it this way. Imagine that one was a skilled violinist. You would say that you were a virtuoso. You had a virtuosity in playing the violin. Now, Vertu in politics is just the same. It's about learning the skill of politics. It's about learning to do what you needed to do in a particular situation to your best advantage. Machiavelli famously likens this to the metaphor of the foxes and the lions. You know, the lions get their way by scaring people. Foxes get their way by being crafty and cunning, if you will. For Machiavelli, the point was not to be a lion all the time, or not to be a fox all the time, but to learn when one needed to be like a lion and when one needed to be like a fox, and employ both skills at the correct time. That is virtuosity in politics. That is Vertu. That is being a virtue, a manly political man that would attract fortune to you. So now we've seen that Machiavelli thinks that a prince shouldn't be virtuous in the religious, moral or Christian sense, but rather should exhibit Vertu in order to attract fortune to him. Now, he does say, however, that if one doesn't have the Christian virtues, sometimes it would be good to appear as if you do have them. So sometimes, although you shouldn't act in a Christian manner, you should appear to do so. And this was the crucial thing with Machiavelli. And if one is looking at the podcast on Hobbes, you'll see that Hobbes has a very dim view of human nature. Machiavelli is the same. For Machiavelli, people are stupid and ignorant who judge more with their eyes than they do with their hands. If you appear to be something as a prince, he says, people will believe that you are that thing you appear to be. Appearances are very important for Machiavelli, because people are unable to judge the true nature of you and the true nature of your rule. So there it is. Now, finally on Machiavelli, if one exhibits Vertu, that is to say, of politics, fortune to you, this ends up in you having a glorious state. Now, if you read Machiavelli's The Prince, in some places it reads a bit like a history book. Because Machiavelli thinks in order for you as a prince to become a glorious ruler, what you should do is look back at history, look at princes who have been regarded as great historical examples of leading glorious states, and try and copy them. Machiavelli uses history in a way perhaps that we don't today. He sees history as providing a storehouse of examples of things that we can copy and use in everyday politics. Perhaps today we don't think we can use examples from the past in a similar way. Maybe we do, maybe we don't. But for Machiavelli, the goal of the prince is to become one of these examples, to become the example of a glorious leader that future generations would look back on. That is being a glorious state, or being a glorious leader, and having a glorious state. And it is that which is the goal of politics for Machiavelli. If one produces that glorious state, the state that future generations look back on, if you've acted unvirtuously in order to get there, it doesn't matter one bit. The ends justify the means, so long as the ends are glorious.